Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk to you about the best recording of Holst's The Planets. Now, I have an apology to make because I thought I did a video on the best recording of The Planets, but I didn't actually. I did a review of the reference recording performance of The Planets with Michael Stern and the Kansas City Symphony, which is really, really good. It's a wonderful performance, a fabulous performance rhythmically, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I didn't do a whole sort of retrospective of Planets recordings, so I'm going to do that now. And we're going to go through, oh God, I've got 15 or 16 of them sitting here. It's been recorded so often. It's such a marvelous, marvelous piece. And poor old Gustav, which was his name, he was English, not German. He wasn't a Gustav, he was a Gustav. And actually, when I was in high school, I had a friend whose father named his cat Gustav after Holst, not after Mahler. His name was Gustav the cat. Anyway, poor old Gustav Holst never recaptured the fame that he acquired for doing The Planets, which pissed him off to no end. And I kind of feel for him. But the fact of the matter is that nothing he wrote later was as much fun or as interesting as The Planets. So there you go. He was a wonderful composer, by the way. There's a lot of good music that he wrote, make no mistake. But did anything quite have the color, the richness, the conceptual daring, the excitement, the general orchestral mastery? And I mean, The Planets is just one of those things that happens, once in the lifetime of certain composers. And unfortunately for Holst, it sort of happened towards the beginning. So we're talking about The Planets and good performances and some bad ones too, because there have also been a lot of terrible, terrible, terrible recordings of The Planets. It's an easy piece to ruin. It really, really is. You'd be surprised. Now, The Planets is really an ingeniously organized piece. It really is. It has a certain larger structure that has to do with the rhythmic distribution of the movements. For example, both Mars and the last one, Neptune or whatever it is, Uranus, I never get it straight. It's Neptune, pardon me. I get the last planets kind of mixed up. I don't know why, but I do. Anyway, they're both in 5/4, irregular meters, although one is extremely rhythmic and one is almost rhythmless, but they're both in 5/4. And then as you move in from each side, you get interesting things. You've got Venus, which is the most peaceful, and on the other side you have Uranus, the magician, which is the most rambunctious of all of them. And then you have Jupiter in the middle, functioning sort of as a fulcrum around which the whole thing rotates. It's a very, very nicely balanced assortment of movements, which Holst has selected according to the planets according to their Sanskrit or some other, astrological indications as to what the planets mean. Now, one thing I do need to tell you is that everything about this piece, as I've suggested, involves rhythm. And I don't just mean the irregular rhythms in the outer movements. There are really difficult compound rhythms. For example, in Mercury, which is in 6/8, it's which is fairly straightforward, 6/8, but it has rhythms that cut across the basic pattern, which are quite complicated. I mean, when I played it with the Stanford Symphony, I was doing the glockenspiel in some of these movements, and there's a rhythm in Mercury. Bum bum ba ta 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 tum ba tan 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 ta 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 tum ba tan tan tan. It's very hard to get right. It really, really is. And the same thing in Uranus. Ba-da-dum ba 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 bum, ba-da-dum ba 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 bum, ba-da-dum ba 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 bum. You find these marvelous rhythmic ostinatos, and that's how Holst sort of builds his movements. And it's really, they're really cool. I mean, when you get down to it, the climax of Saturn, which is very slow, it's Saturn, the bringer of old age. It's really a slow movement, and it's a march, a dragging march. But a lot of the rhythm is off the beat. So you have like when the bells are banging at the top, it's bwah, crash, bomb, crash. That's bang, 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 like this. Doing all of that can be very, very tricky. And there are a lot of performances where the orchestra is just slack in terms of its rhythm, and the conductor doesn't bring out the rhythm correctly, which allows the music to sort of die on the vine. And so the best performances are rhythmically extremely accurate. And also, orchestral color is the other big deal. There's all kinds of crazy instruments in here. There's an organ, of course, which backs up, the pedals back up various things in Uranus, and the organ shows up in Mars at the climax. And there's a bass oboe, a heckelphone, as it's sometimes called. You hear it in Salome's Dance of the Seven Veils. It's a thing going, but Holst uses a heckelphone, which is very hard to come by. There are some really fascinating instrumental sonorities, which make the piece also, something of a specialty work, although nowadays it gets played all the time, and it's been recorded so often, sometimes many times by the same people. I find it almost shocking, absolutely surprising that there can be so many of them out there, and so many bad ones. Oh my goodness. You'd think in a piece that relies almost entirely on rhythm and orchestral color that the conductor would take special pains to bring out the rhythm and orchestral color. But he doesn't, or she, often not. It's really a shocker. The tam-tam, by the way, this is the coolest tam-tam part in the world in Mars. It really is. It starts with a roll that goes on for bars and bars until the first big climax. It's like this. Boom, 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 da, da, da. There's like a crescendo. Oh, it's so much fun. Oh, let me do that. It's so much fun to do. It's swells and crescendos and things. You whack the crap out of it at the climax. How many performances do you not even hear it at all, whether at the beginning or at the climax? It's absolutely appalling, a disgrace that you don't hear what Holst actually wrote, especially in his most daring and sort of audacious moments. So I'm these are some of the things that I listen for. And when I talk to you about these recordings, which we're going to start doing right now, they're things I would like you to listen for too, if you get a chance, because, there's so much in this piece. The harp writing alone is a clinic. There's just so much wonderful use of color and rhythm here, and it just goes for naught in many performances. Really, really shocking. So, without further ado, let's get to the best performances, but we're going to start with some of the worst ones, or some of the weirdest ones in any case. First, a sucky one. Ugh, oh boy. This one is really bad, and it shocked me to death. Here it is, Andrew Davis with the BBC Philharmonic. Of course, it's one of the duller orchestras in the world, as I've never tire of mentioning. But boy, it's one of those performances that's almost completely insensitive to the music's color, to balance, to all those things. It's just a work-a-day, dreary, let's go do the planets, let's do the planets. Let's do the planets again, Never mind. It's just boring. Boring! Terrible. And Davis has done it twice, and neither of them are all that great. Although his earlier one on Teldec, Warner, was much better than this new one on Chandos. What did they need that for? I have no idea. Next, here's the weird one. This is the one with Bernard Herrmann. Remember this? It was on Phase 4. Now, Bernard Herrmann had this weird habit. You would think a guy who wrote so much great film music, including science fiction music, would really be good with the planets. Oh my God, he's awful. He conducted everything at half tempo. For a guy who was apparently incredibly arrogant and hot-tempered and quick to boil, for some reason his conducting is really slow and soporific. That's the word for it, soporific. So this is these soporific planets on Eloquence with Bernard Herrmann. It's kind of fun for, the ridiculously multi-mic sonics and to hear, Herrmann's vivisection of the work. But a great Planets it ain't. Also kind of iffy. I mean, a good performance, but curiously lacking in, I think, conviction is Bernstein's at the New York Phil. There's a wonderful story. I don't know if I've told this before, but I might as well tell it again, which is that a friend of mine who worked at Sony suggested to Bernstein that he do the Planets. And of course, he scheduled it in the concert, but he hadn't conducted it before. And he had no idea how tricky the whole thing was. And apparently it was a complete disaster. And my friend walked into the green room afterwards, and Bernstein looked at him and said, "You son of a bitch! Why didn't you tell me it was such a pain in the ass?" Well, doesn't sound like it's a pain in the ass. They got it together for the recording, but it's not a great recording, and it's not something that you would think would have a lot of charisma and pizzazz, and it doesn't. It doesn't. It simply doesn't. So now the rest of these are all very, very good in one way or another. Fun to listen to, marvelously played, beautiful. And let's start, since we've been talking about him a lot recently, with Zubin Mehta and the Los Angeles Philharmonic. This is, Zubin Mehta and the Los Angeles Philharmonic. It's Hollywood's orchestra, if you want to call it that. And they play the bejesus out of it. It's just terrific. Beautifully recorded. Exciting. It does all the things the Planets is supposed to do. So this is worth considering. Next, believe it or not, he did the Planets. Charles McCarris. This was on Virgin with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic. Typical McCarris. You can always count on McCarris to capture every detail that needs to be observed or captured and project it to you, the listener. And that's what he does here. It's a little bit light on its feet. McCarris was a fleet conductor. He tended not to dawdle, but my, oh my, you hear so much of this performance. It's so much fun to listen to. It's absolutely marvelous. Another marvelous, this is a live recording that was a big surprise to me, is Vladimir Jarofsky on the LPO label with the London Philharmonic. I mean, that, of course, was Adrian Bolt's orchestra, and he recorded it 50 times, and we're going to get to him, don't worry. But this is really good. Really, really fine performance. Exciting, well played, vivid with the sort of vitality of a live performance, the level of tension, and it's just splendid. Worth hearing. And here's a real sleeper. I love this performance. Oh my goodness. It's absolutely marvelous. Charles Groves. This is with the Royal Philharmonic. It's on Sanctuary Classics. Groves was one of those, he was like McCarris. He was one of those conductors who never saw a climax he couldn't nail. He was incredibly musical. He lets the musicians play at the big moments. He's very keenly observant in the quieter moments. He has a few sort of interesting tempos here, but he makes everything work. I mean, I would listen to Charles Groves conduct the telephone directory. He would make it interesting. And this is a marvelous, marvelous Planets. Don't let it pass you by if you haven't noticed it before. And now we get to some of the, blockbusters. Pavlo Yarvey on Telarc with the Cincinnati Symphony with a very, very good Britain Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. This is really gorgeous sounding, brilliantly recorded, very, very well played, exactly what you want. The Planets is not the most expressive piece in the world. In fact, I looked at the score. There is only one expressive indication in the entire work. Just one. There's a dolce on the clarinet solo in Neptune at the very end. Do 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 that tune. It gets a dolce. Otherwise, Holst only gives dynamics and articulation and accent marks. There is nothing expressive about this piece because it's all space music. It really is. I mean, that doesn't mean it should be played without vibrato and the strings. What I mean is that Holst did not feel the need to indicate any special emphasis throughout. And it says something about, first of all, the kind of composer he was. I mean, he knew in his own work, his daughter Imogene says that toward the end of his life, he tried to recapture some of the warmth that he knew had been lacking in his work to that point. Holst was great at space music. He was great at writing music that was alien and spooky and atmospheric, and also the Hymn of Jesus. I mean, spiritual. he did all of that extremely well because his music isn't terribly emotional. It really isn't. And The Planets has no emotions in it. It has great tunes. It has great color. It has great rhythm. But, an expressive masterpiece? No, it's not. It's not romantic music at all. And so for that reason, it's often done very well by conductors who do a lot of contemporary music, which also is not terribly expressive in the conventional sense, or which uses pattern and sound and texture in sort of the abstract way, even though this is programmatic, it's not abstract. So that's a long way of saying that a lot of young conductors do it really well, and Yarvey does it really, really, really well. Also on Telarc Yulevian and the Atlanta Symphony, for exactly the same reason. These performances don't actually sound that much alike, but they're successful for the same reason. They are straightforward, beautifully conducted, precise, incredibly well played, and magnificently recorded. And really, that's all The Planets kind of needs. It's fascinating to me how many conductors make a mess of it, because most conductors feel the need to do something, when really what they ought to do is just make sure everyone does what they're supposed to do and then get out of the way and let them do it. Right? Right. Also, a knockout of a performance. William Steinberg with the Boston Symphony on Deutsche Grammophon. Absolutely fabulous. This is fast. This is fast and exciting. It's a lot like Holst's own recordings, which are mostly terrible, by the way. He did it a couple times. But this is really thrilling. This is just a vicious, take no prisoners, let it rip. Planets fabulously played and very vividly recorded. It's a marvelous performance, and it's so different from all the other versions of the Planets out there that you really ought to have it. Just if you're a Planets person, just so that you have it. I want to take a minute now before we finish up. I have my final batch here, the final three, and before we get to the final three, I want to have a little planetary interlude. The planetary interlude is this. You should avoid, like death, any versions of the Planets that try and complete the Planets by adding Pluto, for example. I was so happy when Pluto got deplanetized because it meant that crappy Pluto that was added to the piece. Like, who did it? Like Colin or David Matthews or both of them or someone like that? God, it was horrible. It was added to like lousy recordings of the Planets to make them more interesting, and it didn't. Do not get any Planets that have more planets. What Holst did was fine, but the funniest release I ever saw was EMI back in, the 90s, thought they were going to capitalize on the Planets by doing a sequel. And what they did was, it was like the Planets Part 2, or I forget what it was called. More planets, even more planets. Well, there were no other planets to do. So they took satellites, like, the moon, or Triton, or Ganymede. They took satellites and they gave them monikers like Holst did. Remember, there was Mars, the bringer of war, or Neptune, the mystic, or Uranus, the magician. By the way, I call it Uranus. Don't give me any crap about it, folks. Oh, that's appropriate if you're calling it Uranus, isn't it? You shouldn't give me any crap about it. I'm not being politically correct, but I grew up with it called Uranus. And then I remember when Voyager did like the flyby, all of a sudden it became Uranus, because some censor of the news media decided calling it Uranus was a little too provocative. Well, I don't care. That's what I'm calling it. It's how I grew up with it, and that's what I'm sticking with. Anyway, so this recording had all of these other like satellites with their monikers, and they just pulled crap from their catalog, miscellaneous stuff, and excerpts from other pieces so it was just, all it was a classical pops collection with excerpts named after various planetesimals and planetoids. And the funny thing about it is that, Jupiter has 79 moons. I mean, they could have made a 12-disc set out of this, just doing Jupiter. I don't know what they're all called, but imagine, you have Viagra, bringer of low self-esteem, set to Mozart's Serenata Notturna. I mean, that's the kind of stuff they were doing. It was so bizarre and such a stupid idea. Anyway, I don't know what happened to it. I hope no one ever tries it again. It's just ridiculous what they've done to the planets to try and capitalize on its popularity. But we're going to talk now about my 3 favorite recordings of the planets, and you could pick, obviously, from all of these. They're all the ones that I've recommended, which are really good. I think you should avoid the ones that are really bad. But let's talk about number 3 of the 3 biggies, Charles Dutoit with the Montreal Symphony. Isn't that a surprise, isn't it? Surprise, it shocked the hell out of me. I wasn't expecting it. But I have to say, this is as colorful and exciting and well played and beautifully recorded a performance as you are ever going to hear. Dutoit in Montreal could be surprising. It's like everyone else who gets pigeonholed. Like Karajan getting pigeonholed himself as a German conductor when his best performances were all other things, And Dutoit's the same thing. He was supposed to be a French music conductor, and they recorded tons and tons of French music. But the truth of the matter is, he did one of the best Shostakovich Eighth Symphonies I've ever heard in my life. And this recording of the planets is magnificent. It's absolutely magnificent. It's fabulous. It's exactly the kind of stuff that Dutoit did well. It has lots of color. It has that crispness and discipline. In a way, when you think about it, it's really very French, the music, because it has that kind of pinpoint precision that, you really should have. And you would think French people would do it very well. And so I recommended Dutoit very highly on Decca. The other one that you really need to get, here he is. I mean, I'll bet you were wondering when this would come up, right? Adrian Bolt. I'm not going to diss Adrian Bolt. He conducted the premiere. He always did a great Planets, and he recorded it 4 times. And this box has 3 of them from 1945, and then, there was one in the 1966, and then a very, very late one, 1978. The best one in terms of orchestral discipline is probably 66. The best sonics are 78. It was just before digital recording took off. It was one of those vintage EMI recordings. It's absolutely marvelous. Absolutely marvelous. And if you have this one, for some reason, I never understood. The English press always raved about Prevens. Prevens is so boring. It's boring and it's colorless. Absolutely colorless. And that means no tam-tam at the climax of Mars. I don't know what was going on with that recording, but these are the real deal. And Adrian Bolt is marvelous in this music. Absolutely marvelous. And he stayed that way until he was like 175 and near death. He still did it fabulously well. And here's a guy who doesn't drag. He's not like Bernard Herrmann. I suppose you could want, for example, a little more mystery at the very end, in Neptune. Just a little bit more spookiness. Who's great with that, as you might expect? Well, there are 2 that are great with that. Bernard Haitink, who otherwise is quite slow and dull in many places, very beautifully played, but not really all that exciting. And Stokowski, who has the weirdest, of course, of all the recordings because he changes the orchestration around and he plays the whole thing like band music. I mean, it's as though you'd have no strings. It's really weird because it's Stokowski, but boy, does he nail, the mysterious harp, stuff at the end in Neptune. That's a Stokowski specialty. But again, it's a recording that I like as a Stokowski version, but I wouldn't recommend it if you really want The Planets by Holst, instead of by Leopold. If you want it by the composer, then you have to get one of the Bolt recordings. You just have to. I mean, there's no question about it. But, however, my favorite recording of the Planets, and this one may surprise you too, my favorite recording of the Planets is Karajan with the Vienna Philharmonic, not the Berlin one, which is neither as well recorded nor as well played. This one with the Vienna Phil, boy, it sounds like they really had something to prove. And the Vienna Philharmonic is not the orchestra you generally think about when you think about rhythm, really tight rhythm, the kind of relaxed, schmoozy Viennese rhythm. No, this one, they all had to work to do it right, and they did, and it is fantastic. It sounds marvelous. Karajan was a colorist, right? That's what he was. He wasn't a contrapuntal guy. He wasn't a line guy. He was a chord guy. And boy, the Vienna plays these chords like no one else has ever played them. It's absolutely spectacular. Spectacular in every way. I come back to it over and over again. And every time I listen to it, I'm shocked. I'm just shocked by how good it is, how marvelous it still sounds. It really blew me away, and it still does every time I listen to it. I always come to it with low expectations. I really do. And then it just grabs you and never lets you go. I would go for the Karajan Vienna Planets as just all around the most satisfying performance. But like I said, you got to have a Bolt. Dutoit is marvelous. Steinberg is thrilling. McCarris is McCarris. Zubin Mehta is really marvelously Hollywood-esque, which is what the piece is. Let's not kid ourselves. Don't poo-poo Hollywood. Hollywood is fabulous. There's a Planets for everybody. And if I didn't mention yours, what can I tell you? There's only a limited number of planets. Maybe you can do Callisto or Io or Europa. Go make your own planets. We should have a contest. I think we should, right? To do our own planets at some point. Don't try it now. I think we have enough. We have more than enough. So keep on listening, folks. Enjoy the planets. All the best.